tiempo te queda en mí. Divino che spantavo, divino che molo siamo, ma chissà se da tempo fa vostra. Mi corazón está vivo, mi pensamiento cubo y mi wow y cariño está bailando. Ahora come mi rabo trovi, me enfoqué conmigo, que espantavo, ma tampoco me estresa. Mi corazón está vivo, mi pensamiento cubo y mi wow y cariño está bailando. Ven mi ama misa, vos também estimame, no que espantavo, ma volta tempo pra gozar. Aleva, 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 ei, 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 ei. Si corri para su pista, ta arriba vos. Dimas con ay, que ti trabalha babo. Ay, mas já tem me que cubo estimame. Por no engane, é baile de amor. Ay, babo, esta mula, esta valia. Cubo en da verde energía. Ay, mas já tem que vamos companheiro. Por no ninguém, é baile de amor. É baile de amor. É baile, é baile. É baile, é baile, é baile de amor. You know, I think it's a good moment to introduce to you the members of my band. Here on my side, my good friend and great singer, Giovanka Ostiana. On guitar, Mr. Ed Verhoef. On percussion from New York, Mr. Bruno Saturnino. On drums, my little brother, not so little anymore, but okay, Roel Galister. On bass, Mr. Reno Steva. On piano, Mr. Mark Bishop. And we have there, is my sound man. I would like to give him an applause to Mr. Julio Hernandez. Hey, hey, la 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 It's a good moment to introduce friend and great singer, Giovanka Ostiana. On guitar, Mr. Ed Verhoef. On percussion from New York, Mr. Bruno Saturnino. On drums, my little brother, not so little anymore, but okay, Roel Galister. On bass, Mr. Reno Steva. On piano, Mr. Mark Bishop. And we have there, is my sound man. I would like to give him an applause to Mr. Julio Hernandez. lastimavo hobby. Como a cielo luminosa, ma bota parte di me. Ora come mi rabo drumi, mi impoquereta come. Y de mi alma me está sin ti jugo, tan estimami en ti. Y mi no que espantavo, y mi no que modos llavo, ma quizás ya da tiempo pa gozar. Mi corazón está vivo, mi pensamiento cubo, y mi wow y cariño está bailando. Ahora con mi rabo drumi, mi poquereta comi. No que espantavo, ma tampoco me estresa. Mi corazón está vivo, mi pensamiento cubo, y mi wow y cariño está bailando. Ven mi alma misa, cubo tan estimami. No que espantavo, ma bota tempo pa gozar. Aleva, 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 ey, 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 ey.
Buenos dias. Bon dia. Good morning. I'm Brian Winter. I'm the Vice President of Policy for the American Society and the Council of the Americas and the Editor-in-Chief of America's Quarterly. Welcome to this presentation of the fourth annual edition of the Capacity to Combat Corruption Index, the CCC Index, which is jointly prepared by Control Risks and ASCOA. This year's CCC Index presents a mixed picture in which some governments have made progress and others have seen some slippage in the fight against corruption. The overall picture is of a Latin America and the Caribbean where issues like inflation and the continued recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic have clearly pushed anti-corruption efforts to a second-tier issue in some countries, which is understandable. But on the other hand, fighting corruption does remain a key priority for many citizens. I would point out that voters in Sunday's election in Colombia actually cited it as their number one concern in polls. And some governments have responded and continue to push reforms and changes that can strengthen the corruption fighting climate. My friend Geert Aalbers of Control Risks will walk you through this year's results in just a moment. We'll also have presentations from three analysts looking at three countries, the Dominican Republic, Mexico, and Brazil. And we're going to do all of this and take a few questions in 30 minutes or less. This event is public and on the record, and those of you joining us via Zoom can ask us questions via the chat function there. Before I hand things over to Geert, I just wanted to speak briefly about what this index seeks to accomplish and what it doesn't. Unlike other indices and studies, the CCC index does not seek to measure the perceived level of corruption in any given country. Instead, it seeks to measure in a variety of ways the overall environment for detecting, punishing, and preventing corruption in 15 countries. And the purpose in doing so is not to shame or single out any countries, but instead to foster a debate about the policies and reforms that can help, policies which will ultimately strengthen democracies, create a better business climate, and reduce inequality. In the end, the key to fighting corruption, it's not really a secret. It's about strengthening democratic institutions. And so that's what we're here to discuss this morning. Without further ado, I'd like to pass things to my friend, Geert Aalbers, partner at Control Risks. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brian. And hello, everyone. It's good to be back here. This is our fourth edition, as Brian mentioned, of the CCC Index. And First of all, I'd like to thank American Society Council of the Americas. It's just such a splendid partnership we've had over the past couple of years. It's not only been tremendously rewarding and enjoyable working with you, but it's been a great learning experience, I think, for all of us. So just want to put that out there. As Brian mentioned, this year, we kind of struggled with, to find a creative adjective. It wasn't so creative. We call it mixed. There really is a mixed picture across the region. But overall, I think, certainly after some pretty significant regression over the past couple of years, certainly last year, we see a certain degree of stability, or perhaps, depending on the perspective, stagnation across the region. Emily, if you could please put up the results here, then we can quickly walk through those, because we'd like to get to discussing with the analyst. Thanks a lot there. So as you'll see, Uruguay was the top performer. And for those who have been following the index over the past couple of years, that is a repeat from the past couple of years. This is followed by Costa Rica and Chile. And all three have been top three ranked in the index since 2020. Now, the bottom end was a bit of a repeat from last year. So Guatemala, Bolivia, and Venezuela. Overall, and we can go to the next slide here, there were 4 countries which saw significant declines, the sharpest of which you'll see here was in Guatemala, but there were also pretty significant declines in Brazil, Mexico, and this is actually a continuation of a trend we saw over the past 2 years. And we'll discuss that, actually 3 years since 2019. And we'll discuss that in more detail. Both countries, I think they're the ones where a lot of attention has been placed also in some of the media coverage that's come from the index. Moving in the opposite direction, we saw significant improvements, particularly in Dominican Republic, but followed by Costa Rica, Panama, Paraguay, and Chile. And we will discuss the Dominican Republic case shortly as well, because it is quite an interesting story. Before I move on, I just want to highlight, I won't go through the methodology, but the index is based on quite a lot of data. This comes from expert survey responses, and it comes from public data. And the methodology is outlined in the report, which is publicly available. So please do feel free to take a look there, and you can get a better understanding how we put the index together. But I did want to close off on a couple of comments before I hand over to Mário to discuss Brazil. So the first one, and I think this is an important one because we do quite a lot of interviews around these, we get quite a lot of questions around the index, is that the actual ranking of the country for us is actually less important than the actual trends. And I highlight this year, for example, I don't expect you to have memorized the scores there, but if you look at the index, you look at the report, you'll see that the difference between 7th place, so it was Panama, and Brazil in 10th place is about 0.2 points. That is really not that material. What's more important, however, is that these two countries are moving in opposite directions. Brazil on a downward trend and Panama on an upward trend. So I think that's the takeaway. The second point is that this year, we saw that the capacity to combat corruption was stable and intact, even in some countries which recently had elections, such as Chile, Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Peru, which indicates a certain level of resilience and strength of the anti-corruption institutions in those countries. Not all of them are as strong or resilient as others, but certainly that was a notable feature. The third point I'd like to highlight is that the trend in the trend in the variable democracy and political institutions, and particularly lawmaking and rulemaking processes, appears, we don't have very hard statistical evidence for that yet, but it appears to be a good indicator for where a country may be heading in terms of capacity to combat corruption. This has really been the Achilles heel for both Brazil and Mexico over the past 3 years. Brian already mentioned, that despite the fact that, the economic malaise, inflation, obviously lingering effects of the pandemic are really front of mind for most citizens in Latin America. It doesn't mean that corruption has been relegated to, a very low priority. And Brian correctly mentioned that in Colombia, it actually featured as one of the key issues. The fifth point, and this is my second last point here, is that while there's clearly signs of regression in a number of countries, I think it's important to highlight the significant advances that have been made in the public domain, institutions, independence of institutions, enforcement agencies, but also investments made by companies in compliance and investing in greater, more transparent business practices. And this means, I think it's hard to, this is a qualitative judgment, but I think we're still in a better place now than we were 10 years ago. And finally, having done this exercise for 4 years, I think we can all confidently assert now that there really is no correlation between political ideology and how well or poorly, a country fares in the index. And again, Brazil and Mexico are perfect examples of countries which, the presidents campaigned on anti-corruption platforms. They sit on opposite ends of the political spectrum. However, they share very similar approaches and tactics on how to undermine the anti-corruption movement. So on that note, I'll hand over to Mário, who will provide some of the highlights and perhaps some of the lowlights as well of Brazil. And thanks again for tuning in this year.
Thank you, Geert. And focusing on Brazil, as Geert mentioned, the overall score fell 6% since last year to 4.76. And looking at the bigger picture, the trend, it has declined 22% since 2019. When we try to break down the numbers, we see that the steepest decline was in the variable that assesses lawmaking and ruling process. And here we're talking about both about enabling and disabling legislation, so rules and laws that help or undermine the country's capacity to combat corruption. We have to keep in mind some opaque processes in Congress stemming from pork barreling politics, for example, related to budget allocation, which have not been transparent in Brazil over the past year, and also legislators' attempts to increase their influence over oversight bodies, such was the case of the prosecutor's office council. Another highlight when we see the many variables that compose the index was the 19% decline in the variable assessing the anti-corruption agency's independence and efficiency. This comes amid Bolsonaro's attempts to consolidate control over these investigative bodies, especially around cases that involve his inner circle. It also includes like the federal police or the federal revenues service, for instance. There have also been budget cuts which have impaired their capacity to investigate, and this was especially the case for the Council for Financial Activities Control, COAF, and there have also been significant high-profile cases, such as the one involving kickbacks and wrongdoings that haven't moved forward. Another practice that the current administration has taken has been the appointment of allies to key positions. Again, this was the case of the Prosecutor General's office, but also some intelligence agencies and even the federal police. On the other hand, we have recent evidence that showcases that these strategies have not been entirely successful. Just as yesterday, a former minister was arrested in a case potentially involving corruption allegations. So this brings me to the upside, that despite this recent deterioration of the integrity environment over the past years, this has not been able to fully reverse the institutional strengthening that Brazil has undergone over the past decades. So there are still some bright spots in the country's anti-corruption efforts. And here we must mention the country's civil society and media resilience. These institutions have continued to uncover corruption cases, actually, and corruption allegations, both at the federal and also local levels. And when we look more specifically, there have also been progress, for example, when we talk about the Comptroller General, the CGU, which has been taking more prominent role when promoting or negotiating agreements and resolutions for corruption-related matters. So this is the big picture for Brazil. We move now to Mexico with Alejandra Soto.
Thank you, Mário, and hi, everyone. And well, as we all know, here in Mexico, we have heavy anti-corruption rhetoric on behalf of the president. But this year's index and actually the downward trend for the past 3 years shows that despite this rhetoric, this has not translated into an actual better capacity to combat corruption in the country. This year, Mexico fell from 11th to 12th place, and we are only now behind Venezuela, Bolivia, and Guatemala in the index. And similar to what happened in Brazil, I mean, there were setbacks in all categories, but the main decline was within democracy and political institutions, and particularly in the variable that assesses lawmaking and ruling processes. This reflects the executive branch's perceived efforts to interfere in judicial and legislative matters, which is a result of the president's attempt to centralize power and decisions. And we can see this through several things that have been happening. We have seen that all legislation, and especially the legislation that would have significant consequences for the country, all reflects the president's wishes. There's no debate going on, despite some maybe public forums being organized, but they are not taken into account. And the only thing that matters is what the ruling coalition wants in this high-profile legislation. Also, we have the president stating that legislators who voted against his electricity reform bill committed treason, and this actually resulted in some members of the ruling party trying to file legal processes against these legislators. So this is all going on it has been going on in the country, and this affects what happened in the index. But we also have the president stating that some Supreme Court rulings, which are against his administration policies, are protecting elites. And on his daily press conferences, just talking against some of these institutions. So this is all part of what happened there in the index on this setbacks on this category. But we also, on top of this, we lag behind the regional average and the variable that assesses the efficiency and independence of anti-corruption agencies, and there are significant signs of erosion in some of them. The national anti-corruption system is underfunded and understaffed, and the federal government has suggested actually to eliminate the system's independent unit that is in charge of designing and evaluating anti-corruption policy. We saw the former head of the finance ministry's financial intelligence unit that was ousted in November last year. He was famous for his technical knowledge and the numerous cases that he was investigating, and the new appointment was appointed there for political reasons. And also we see the Attorney General office, the Attorney General actually being involved in legal scandals that reveal that he has used the institution for personal gain, and this to the detriment of the administration of justice. We also have to look into what's coming next, and we need to pay attention to Congress will be voting on a presidential proposal to put the Ministry of Public Administration, another key anti-corruption institution, to put it in charge of both government procurement and supervising public spending. This could, of course, undermine transparency and accountability, because the agency would then be auditing itself instead of an autonomous body supervising public spending. And we will still see the president's public criticism every day of the media and NGOs dedicated to anti-corruption issues. And so all this, and combined with the fact that a significant proportion, actually 80% of government contracts last year were awarded without a bidding process, and also the armed forces taking over numerous areas of the public administration, from public security to the control of ports and customs to infrastructure projects and logistics. And this, the armed forces are not subject to the same scrutiny than other civil institutions. So this is all things that we have to look forward to pay attention to in the coming year. Overall, this, of course, reduces the competitiveness of the country and actually incentivizes corrupt behaviors in the future. So this is, again, as Mário said, the big picture of what's going on in Mexico. But we will be happy to take questions, but I'll hand it over to Alan right now to talk a little bit about what's going on in the Dominican Republic.
Thanks, Alejandra. Good morning, everybody. So the Dominican Republic, it's the rising star of the index for a second straight year. The country improved its score and it moved from the 10th place in 2021 to the 5th place in 2022 with an overall score of 5.1 out of 10. The most significant improvement of the Dominican Republic came in the legal capacity category. It almost improved 25% the score from the previous ranking, and 6 out of 7 categories from this legal capacity chapter are above the regional's average for the Dominican Republic. So it's an indication that the efforts being taken by the administration of President Luis Abinader's anti-corruption strategy are starting to give some good results. So for example, one of the cornerstones of this anti-corruption strategy has been a push for increased the autonomy and independence of anti-corruption institutions. For example, in February, since February, Abinader has been pushing for a reform to elect the Attorney General without the interference of the executive. So the president will be taking out of this process of picking the Attorney General in order to make him more independent and also to increase the autonomy of the public ministry. Likewise, this government is trying to get rid of influence peddling and the fact that contracts with the government are relying on political connections. An example of these attempts to get rid of these practices is the assassination of then Minister of Environment and Natural Resources, Orlando Jorge Mera, in early June. So the ministry already refused a series of contracts to a company, but the attacker was trying to get them approved by the minister, taking into consideration that they were close friends. And the ministry was in pace to refuse those contracts again because these were not complying with the environmental laws. So this also highlights the fact that within the administration, there are officials that are trying to get rid of these practices. Likewise, the government is trying to use more tenders and public biddings to give contracts. A recent example of these biddings are the ones granted last month to build two power plants in Manzanillo, in the Montecristi province. And there's also another tender currently to expand Manzanillo's project as well. So there's an indication that the government is trying to make more transparent and clear these processes when dealing with the government. However, there are some challenges. For example, also with these tenders, in December 2020, Youth Ministry, Luz del Alba Jimenez was dismissed because there were some allegations of irregularities with the tenders granted by her ministry. And this is where some sectors of the Dominican population think that this anti-corruption campaign by the Abinader's administration is a little bit politically oriented, because in this case of a former ministry of Abinader's administration, there hasn't begun a formal investigation on her wrongdoings or potential wrongdoings. Whereas the corruption cases such as Antipulpo, Coral, and Coral 5G that involve high-ranking military and security officials of former President Danilo Medina's administration, they are already going through a judicial process and they are likely to get sentenced. So there is one of the challenges of this anti-corruption campaign of Abinader. And going forward, as Brian and Geert mentioned, these economic or inflationary challenges may have an impact on the government's attempt to fight corruption, because some of the resources that were supposed to be allocated or were going to be allocated to strengthening the Office of the Attorney General, to give more resources to judges, to make more expedite these trials related to corruption, are likely to be driven to subsidies, welfare programs, or there's going to be pressure from the Dominican society to move these resources to ease the cost of living in the country. Likewise, there's currently a debate in the Dominican legislative branch about a law that is making more difficult to spread information regarding public officials and people in general. So there are some concerns that these law or this restriction of saying information may have some impact on freedom of speech and the quality of investigative journalism, which is one of the strengths of the Dominican Republic as well. However, these reforms, this one and the one of the Attorney General's office, are likely to be delayed because the government will focus on the economic situation, and hence it's likely to be some slight impact on the anti-corruption campaign, but still it will be one of the rising stars of the region in the coming year. So back to you, Brian.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much, Alan. We have about 5 minutes left and lots of questions, so why don't we treat it as kind of a lightning round? Geert, the first one that came up is about essentially, why don't you guys include the United States and Canada? And if you did, where would they be in the index? And this is a question that we've received a bit over the years, and I think it's a fair one. It reflects internal discussions that we've had. We've thought about it. I don't know where the United States would show up in the current index relative to the other countries. The only thing that I can say with some certainty is my hypothesis is that the overall trend would be pointing down over the last 4 years. Geert, do you have any additional thoughts on that?
No, I don't really have any additional thoughts. And clearly, the countries rank at the top of the index here. So Uruguay, Chile, and Costa Rica. I think what characterizes them, and we'd probably see similar characterization across large parts of Europe, the United States, is a pretty well-balanced scoring across legal capacity, democracy, political institutions, and civil society. That's obviously a very different picture to the largest part of Latin America. We've also had discussions internally whether we should roll this index out globally beyond the US and the like, and Europe. Obviously, that would be a mammoth undertaking, maybe in the next lifetime, but I don't think in the next 5 years.
No, fair enough. Okay, this is a question, Geert, I want to pose to you, but also offer any of the country analysts a chance to jump in, because it goes to the heart of, like I said, that is the positive, constructive discussion that we want to foster with this index and with this event today. And the question is, what are the best practices in legislation that would most help countries with declining CCC trends to reverse their scores? For example, would increased independence of anti-corruption institutions and processes, like we saw in the Dominican Republic, help in countries such as Guatemala? Geert, do you want to reply to that first?
Yeah, I'll take I am sure that Mário and Alejandra and Alan will have things to contribute to that specific response. It's an interesting question because it touches on what kind of legal capacity, institutions and legal tools to combat corruption should be put in place. And we look at, obviously, anything which helps strengthen the independence of institutions, federal police, the judiciary. Those are absolutely key, but also to combat money laundering, for example. But it also, I think there's an additional element there. It's about legislative practices in and of themselves. And that's one of the points which I mentioned, which is, I think, a good indicator of where a country may be heading. So maybe Mário, Alejandra, or Alan, you can add something on that front, because I think that really goes at the heart of some of the issues we see.
Why don't we do 60 seconds each? Alejandra, would you like to start?
Yes, that is a great question, and I agree that strengthening institutions and making strong, independent, autonomous institutions to oversee corruption issues is important. But also the relevance of having good processes in place to appoint key people, because right now what we're seeing with the Attorney General in Mexico, It's now independent, which is supposed to be a good step. But now we see that it's becoming, nobody can touch the Attorney General that is now accused of using the institution for personal gain. So it has to do with the institutions, but also with the mechanisms to appoint the right people in office. Otherwise, you get stuck with some not so great consequences, despite the independence of the institution.
Mário, anything to add from a Brazilian perspective?
Sure, very briefly, I think when we think about the types of legislation that can be improved, we can think, for example, about the practice of lobbying and how rules that make clear standards and like mark the line between good practice and bad practice of lobbying can improve the integrity environment, and also political maybe reforms or changes that also improve the relationship between the executive and the legislative. So when we think about countries that have loose party ideology, where they have a fragmented party system in which the president has to resort to coalition building that is harder to make, they are more tempted to resort to corrupt practice to do so. So when you have in place a system that is also crafted in a way that mitigate these risks, there could also be an improvement in that direction.
Alain, the final word is with you. Just 1 minute.
Thank you. I will just add two points to the answer of my colleague. So the first one is not the legislation per se, but how you implement it. Now you have the legislation. Okay, let's enforce it, and let's make sure that this enforcement it's more from a state perspective rather than a government perspective. Now that regardless the next administration coming in, if it's from the same party or the contrary party, this legislation will remain in place, and it will also ensure that these anti-corruption issues get solved. And also, I think a very important point for this thing is the involvement of society. Pressure from the civil society, the media, the universities, NGOs, so that they take this role of functioning as check and balances for the government. It's pivotal for these legislations as well.
Well, thank you very much, Alain. I mean, it really does come down, like I said at the beginning, it comes down to strong independent institutions and the overall quality of a democracy, all aspects of a democracy, not just voting, but also a strong and independent press, civil society, and other groups as well. Those are many of the factors contemplated in the index by design, and it reflects a bit the stories that we've been telling so far this morning. We are out of time, but this is a conversation that will continue. We encourage you to reach out to all of us, either individually or as a group, if you have any further questions. The index and everything we do around it, we try to accept as much feedback as you'll give us. So in that spirit, thank you to our partners at Control Risks. Thank you to all of us who joined us this morning. Have a good day.